This is Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change, and I'm your host, Joshua Sparrow at the Brazelton Touchpoint Center. To find out more about the Brazelton Touchpoint Center and Learning to Listen, just go to brazeltontouchpoints.org and click on Learn with Us and look for Learning to Listen in the Conversations section. There's also a link there to our archive of Learning to Listen conversations over the years. To learn more about and register for more Brazelton Touchpoint Center conversations, events, and trainings, click on the link in the chat. To join the Brazelton Touchpoint Center's Learning Network, look for that link in the chat too. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will be joined by Natalie R. Davis, Assistant Professor of Critical Studies in Education at the Marshall Family School of Education at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, for a conversation about her innovative research focused on learning from and listening to children about Black children's brilliance and their insights into who they are and what it means for them to be in this world. But first, a bit of information about today's Learning to Listen episode. Over 1,500 of us have registered for today's webinar. Please do feel free to tell us about you, where you're from, and what you do in the chat. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Today, our superb interpreter, Natalia Correa, joining us from Bogota, Colombia, will be simultaneously translating our webinar into Spanish. Thank you, Natalia. To access the translation, click on the interpretation icon in your Zoom controls, then select Spanish. To mute the English in the background, select Mute Original Audio. La conversación de hoy será en español e inglés. En los controles de esta reunión, haga clic en Interpretación. Haga clic en el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Para escuchar solo español, haga clic en silenciar audio original. Live captioning is available for today's conversation. In your webinar controls, click Show Captions and select your speaking language. To adjust the size of your subtitles, just click Caption Settings. Please use the chat feature if you have a comment to share or need help with a technical issue. If you would like to receive a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, please be sure you complete the feedback survey. That survey will open in your web browser when the webinar ends. You will also receive a link to the survey at the end of the week in our thank you email. Before we begin, I want to be sure to thank our sponsor, the Burke Foundation, and our Brazelton Touchpoint Center production team, Isabella Mantilla, Michael Accardi, and Kim Oliver. And now, I'd like to introduce today's guest, Professor Natalie Davis. Natalie Davis is an assistant professor of critical studies in education at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Previously, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Early Childhood and Elementary Education and the MA program in Creative and Innovative Education at Georgia State University. Her scholarship has been nationally recognized through early career fellowships awarded by the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation and the Society of Research on Child Development, and through funding from the National Science and Spencer Foundations. She also received the Distinguished Dissertation Award from Division G of the American Educational Research Association on Social Context of Education and the Diamond Dissertation Award from the University of Michigan Marshall Family School of Education. Professor Davis is a learning scientist who studies the relationships between teaching and learning, cultural ecologies, and the socio-political development of children from non-dominant communities, with emphasis on the educational experiences and place-based understandings of city-dwelling Black children. Her work considers if and how our methodological frameworks, theories, and practices demonstrate kinship with youth, advancing pedagogical innovations that intervene on the adult-centered discourses that have characterized the field. She is a former postdoctoral research fellow in the learning sciences at Northwestern University, where she focused on microethnographic analyses of children's thinking and self-determination in community-based STEAM, that's STEAM, learning environments. Professor Davis has collaborated with museums, maker spaces, nonprofit youth-serving organizations, and schools to design curriculum and conduct professional development on topics related to environmental justice, imagination, children's knowing, and the enactment of critical pedagogies. Her work has been disseminated in highly regarded academic journals such as Cognition and Instruction, race, ethnicity, and education, the review of research in education, learning, culture, and social interaction, and via public outlets such as NPR, the STEM for All Multiplex, Michigan Talk Radio, and the Leading Equity podcast. Natalie received her PhD in Educational Foundations from the University of Michigan. You'll soon see why we are so delighted to have Professor Davis with us today. And thank you, Professor Davis, for bringing your work and wisdom to us on Learning to Listen.
Thank you, Josh. It's such a gift, a pleasure to be here. And thank you to all of you all in the audience for joining today. So I think I'll go ahead and share my screen if that's okay. Does everything look okay on your end?
That looks terrific.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. So again, I was hoping to start the conversation today by just providing a little bit of context about how I enter into my work. I thought that context might be helpful and important. As someone who honestly has been curious about the meaning of childhood ever since I was a child. And so one early memory that stands out to me is this was in preschool and elementary school. So imagine me in Detroit some time ago at a school that was called at that time Isaac Newton Elementary School. And there was maybe 4-year-old me in a room with some folks, including a teacher who her name was Miss Morrissey, and maybe some other adult educators or staff from the school and my mom. And I was there to take a test to determine whether or not preschool, I needed to go to preschool, essentially, whether or not preschool was suited for me. And so we sat in this room and there were these colored shapes. And I remember vividly this exercise where I was asked to take the colored shapes and put them into the appropriate hole. So you have a yellow triangle, and I was asked to sort of figure out this matching and kind of complete this puzzle. And I remember doing it very quickly without testing shapes, but just putting the shapes where maybe I intuitively or I understood where they fit. And then there was a moment of quiet in the room. And then I was asked, well, why did you put, say, that yellow triangle into the triangle slot as opposed to one of these other holes? And I remember thinking actually that that was a very strange question to ask. Um, and I responded in a way, I said something sort of confused along the lines of, well, of course I would put the triangle in the triangle space, like it's a triangle. And everyone in the room, all of the adults laughed. Um, and I remember even as a child thinking that that was very strange, that they asked me a question, I responded to that question. And I recall that this happened to me many times as a child. And of course, while I'm hesitant to cast it as a bad thing, because we get the idea that there's a cuteness, there's a humor in terms of where children are just candidly expressing their thoughts or ideas, I did think that it was a curious thing that maybe explains part of the very genesis of my work. That I was already somehow wondering about what it meant to be a child. In my case, to be an opinionated child, a maybe quick-witted child, but not necessarily snarky in terms of sort of how I was looking to interact with adults. But I was already becoming somewhat evident of the dynamic of navigating adult expectations and thinking about how adults listen and engage with children's ideas, particularly when these ideas take a form that may feel unexpected. So maybe fast forward a little bit in the story to when I decided to become a teacher. So now at this point, I was interested in maybe some differently political or ethical interests around teaching high school chemistry. That's what I sought out to do, to become a high school chemistry teacher. But I was interested in chemistry as a window into thinking about societal potential. So where are the possibilities for change in that work? And to be frank, through a process that was so divine and so unexpected, I found myself teaching elementary math and science in a school that had an African-centered focus. And I remember accepting that position and learning that I would be teaching, I would become a third grade teacher and I would teach math and science. And despite being really, really excited about that space, this space that existed for the nourishment of Black children, I also found myself mourning to some extent all of the sophisticated content and experiences that I imagined that I would have together with my students. So I was thinking about, well, how would 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds think with me about histories around scientific malfeasance, for example, or these pathways for solving deeply complex real world problems? I remember that I wrote a chemistry unit. There's actually on the image that you see is the first image to the left. But I wrote a chemistry unit toward the end of my teaching program. And the whole concept behind the curriculum unit was that I wanted to use chemistry or atomic theory as a vehicle for thinking about civil and human rights issues. And so, how can we think about atomic theory, these building blocks, as we think about the scientific discipline, as also where are the parallels in terms of thinking about the building blocks for a beloved community, for example? So this tells you a little bit of sort of where my head was at that time. Um, and so I share this because so even in initiating my own teaching career, that I had to contend with some of my own limiting perspectives about what children knew because I already found myself somewhat contained in this box of expectations. And then honestly, without really having sufficient insight into who my students would be, these third grade children who would be in my classroom. And of course, you enter into that space and they quickly sort of melt and open your heart. And I think I became determined to orient some of my own thinking to thinking about openings in that space and thinking about invitations to invite children into more conversations about what they knew and what they understand about the world. And so again, I share all of that context, one to give you more insight into who I am and how I got into this space, but also to underscore that relative to other folks who just enter into a space of working with younger children because they feel an affinity to children or to childhood. Like we hear this all the time with adults. Like I'm a big kid. I just love children. And so they choose that career path sort of with that in mind because that is a salient part of their identity. But for me, I had a history and experiences that in some ways destabilized the construct of childhood. So I don't know, that may be a point that resonates with some of the folks who are listening. But I think that key as a first step for learning to listen to children is grappling with some of our own notions around who children are and thinking about like how do we live out our own childhoods. So as a child, what are some things that you recall understanding that especially those things that you think if adults would have asked you about that, they might be surprised by your response. Um, what did you love as a child? What are some of the things that you might have resisted and why? And moving out of the space of I just resisted those things because I was a child and I wanted what I wanted and I didn't understand the ways of the world. But if we go a little bit deeper, what are some of the things that you resisted and why? And really, can we recall some of these moments of coloring or attempting to color outside of the lines and to kind of think and move outside of the scripts that adults shape for us? And I think that identifying some of those areas of challenge or confusion or these wonderings, surfacing some of these wonderings can actually become a really generative space for our own growth. So with that, Joshua, I'm gonna pause. I could pause there. If there are anything that's surfacing that you think maybe I might address in the comments, and if not, then I'll move forward and share a little bit more about the project.
We have people joining us from all over the country, and
Awesome.
some hearts and applause appearing periodically. There goes another one.
Yeah, I see it. It's
One,
beautiful. Thank you.
when you talked about beloved community, and one of the things that has drawn me to your work is this deeply respectful way you have of listening to children. And you're being really clear that the assumptions that some of us as adults make about what childhood is and who children are and what our expectations for them really get in the way of listening to them. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about how you go about supporting your conversations with them about big, complex questions, what kinds of things you hear back from them, and how you get your uh, how you get beyond whatever assumptions we might have or whatever agendas we might have as adults to really open up space for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have I'm looking forward to sharing more along those lines. And then I think I even have some examples buried in this, in my presentation to kind of also show where I challenge myself to kind of get out of my own way. So with that, I'll carry on. Um, so what I want to do next, for maybe the next 15 minutes is to maybe immerse you in the space of Black childhood, and provide what will be, of course, a partial window into what it looked like for the children who were participating in a research project that I completed now several years ago. So I'll tell you a little bit about the context for that work and what I was after in that work. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the particulars around the space and place and context. And one thing I'll just surface and say up front is that it is important to know that their home place was also my hometown. So the city where I grew up. And I'll circle back to make some connections as to why I think that was important in this instance. And then I want to share some images, probably too many images, so bear with me, that were crafted by them that became a mechanism to support our dialogue and to support my own deep listening. So as an educational researcher, you know, part of what drew me to this work, this type of work, this genre of work, was the opportunity to engage with children who were like me in some capacity. So these are children who were navigating many of the idiosyncrasies around life in the city in ways that I, based on my own experience, I was poised to intimately understand, and also in ways that I respected. So for some context, at the time when this project was developed, the city where the research was conducted had a population makeup of about 85% Black residents. And public schools, especially at the time when this study was conducted, were the subject of extensive critique. Um, but often, at least from my perspective, this critique did not come with consideration around thinking about systemic inequities or drawing from or engaging deeply with intergenerational community perspectives. And I saw that as an issue. So the work really began, honestly, as more of an inquiry into good elementary schools, and thinking about how they taught Black children, what they taught Black children about their communities, and about the broader society. And this actually led me to two focal institutions. So the two schools that the children attended had their own unique histories. But I do think it's important to know that the schools were regarded by many people in the community as exemplifying the tenacity or the soul of the city, in that they were very explicit in their attempts to offer affirming, holistic supports to Black children, and offering these supports to Black children as Black children, and as children in this particular community. So that led me to these questions about, well, how did the fourth and fifth grade children see themselves in these spaces? How do they see the space, the school context? How do they understand these contexts? And how do they also see themselves? Because maybe most of us would agree that what a school hopes to do, or any institution that's serving children, what they hope to do for children is kind of less important than what they're actually doing in practice. And also less important than what children are taking up through their experiences in that space. So what sticks with children, what changes them, how does it support or facilitate their learning? And so the work sought to also lift up the sense making of Black children in these contexts and to learn more through that process about Black childhoods and to expand these ideas around what counts as learning or meaningful learning in school. So, for example, I had questions in the work about some of the political and the ethical dimensions of learning for Black children who were at that time and still are living with things like food, water, economic instability. They are living with, and in some cases, thriving despite the threat of racism, thinking about blight in their community, fear of mass violence, war, state sanctioned violence, global pandemics. These are things that children are and were, actively wrestling with. And I wanted to put in conversation some of the meaning that they ascribe to self and thinking about their own identity in conversation with how those things interacted with or were changed by, informed by the mission, the culture, and the practices of a school. And so to do that work, I conducted over 60 interviews with Black children, where we took up a number of topics ranging from school to society. And I'll say more about some of the methods that I use to sort of elicit some of their ideas. But for now, I think it is most important that you know that I asked them to draw some pictures for me and to draw a couple of pictures as a tool to support them in expressing their thinking around abstract and nuanced ideas, and thinking about sort of alternative modalities to be able to help them create these invitations and openings to in ways that weren't just limited so I could hear their thoughts and understand what they knew and what they were thinking about, and that those expressions weren't limited to what they might have felt comfortable expressing verbally. And so that leads me to the first prompt that I'll share a little bit more about. Well, what came out of that work? So the first question that I asked children to draw an image to depict, and in response to this prompt, what is it like here in school? So again, we're at these two focal institutions, but what is it like here in school? And maybe you can see quite clearly, like through these drawings, is that, and that I would emphasize that for children, for the most part, they offer very positive depictions of their schools. They communicated to me that they felt loved by their teachers, even when caring for them in the context of school might have meant asking children to do things that they didn't want to do, that children were able to contend with, my teachers care about me and that's why they demand certain things of me or they ask certain things of me, which I also think there's lots of dialogue and discourse that we can have because I think that children get cast in a way that they don't understand these things. They don't understand that adults may have a bigger picture that may be inconsistent with the things that they want in the moment. And in my experience, I think children have a lot to say and can easily recognize that. And so we see these positive depictions of school where we see, I'm happy at school. We see hearts and stars and rainbows and lollipops and puppy dogs and smiles and all of this imagery that speaks to a sense of joy and pride and fulfillment within the school environment. And lots of people may just stop there and say, great, the children, they look happy. They're enjoying their schooling experience. They feel affirmed in their schooling experience. And maybe there's nothing more to learn there. But I was interested in delving deeper into their sense making. So I grew interested in learning more about the things that seemed important to them about these spaces of learning and the context of school. What were they focused on as a consequence of how these schools were designed with their particular mission, vision, and culture? And when I leaned in, to that, then I started to see some patterns also. These ideas that also help to see some of these distinctions between the schooling environment. So I'll show you some images that speak to that. So we have the first school. And I remember clearly, I didn't think to put it on the slide, but there was a child who said, describing the school in a way, and said something like, well, we can't always be just free all the time to just do what we want to do. that we have to like buckle down and lock in, as the young people say nowadays, to get the job done, to accomplish our goals. And so this first school had a big focus around thinking about how do we affirm children? We're a part of this community, but we want each individual student to feel affirmed as an individual. We want them to have a high sense of their own like capacity and capability. And it was tied to these ideas around Black excellence in the school, that each of you are individually excellent. You have a contribution to make in the world. But often the way that that would get animated within the school was also a focus on yourself. Focus on what you have control over in terms of your individual actions, your individual experiences. And we could see in their drawings that this pattern and having a more zoomed in or a sharp focus on self within the context of school. So I actually thought that was really fascinating and interesting that we have many children are depicting their classroom environment when I say, what is it like here in school? And of course, they're drawing a classroom space. That's perhaps not surprising that schools are made up of classrooms and they draw pictures about that. But I thought it was really interesting that how a child might draw their classroom space and draw it as if it is just them and their teacher in the classroom, even though there might be 20 or 30 other students that are in the space with them. And this is where I think the comparative element of the project is actually really significant, because I do think there are a lot of people in the way that children get cast as being so self-centered and egocentric that, of course, we might assume that children will all draw their classroom spaces like in this way. But we see that in the second school, and these are children that more or less live in the same neighborhood. These are schools that are 5 minutes apart. And we get these really different depictions or renderings at a school that's essentially in the same neighborhood and children who make up the same community. And in the second school, we see more of a wide view, more of a community awareness sort of perspective. These images that show how children are recognizing multiple things that might occur. Again, more of this bird's eye view on a classroom experience. So not just me and my interactions between the teacher, but I know I'm doing this in the classroom, and I notice that there are probably 5, 6 other things that are happening at once. Um, and so seeing these many things happening at once, more of a focus on social networks and behaviors to include recognizing disruptions and tensions that may happen over the course of the school day. And then there's also a piece in here in terms of being able to represent symbolically some of the complexity and the layers around their schooling experiences. I think this example it's a little blurry, so I apologize about that. But that I think this is a really beautiful image that speaks to children wrestling with some of the layers and complexities of what school means and what is it like here in school beyond just representing the physical environment. And so in this image, like the child described this image and saying, well, school it's a combination of good days and bad days. And so maybe what I would a prompt or what I would pose to you is like to think about with this image, what does a child have to know or deeply understand to be able to create a composition like this? That there's so many layers and dimensions around thinking about the weather patterns. This is a very sophisticated image and its construction, that we have the sunshine and the clouds and the green grass that are telling me about the good days, and that also some mathematical thinking that's happening, that 90% of the time is the estimate of when I'm having good days in school. And then 9% of the time are what I might characterize as bad days. And I'm not sure what happened with the other 1%, but maybe that's somewhere in the middle. But that this particular child is not only able to represent and assess their own experience and how there may be these ebbs and flows throughout the school day, but that they're also representing and placing each of her peers in terms of the context of the school and community. Based on my understanding of the subjective experience of school for my classmates as well, this is where I feel that they would fall in this representation. So again, I think a really powerful, abstract, complex like use of imagery and symbolism to be able to convey sort of the fullness of the schooling experience. So the next prompt, what does it mean? What does it mean to be Black? So when I asked children to draw me pictures that speak to their racial identity, I saw that they were similarly kind of reconciling or wrestling with this sense of individuality and their pride and sources of joy and affirmation as Black children, with these more ugly or racist or big picture ideas, concepts like happenings that still shape aspects of the present. And so on the one hand, we can see in across the drawings, by and large, their exuberance and we can see their joy. That children, many children rightly so proclaimed, both through their drawings and in their discussions with me, that what it means to be Black is it's just up to me. Like I represent what it means to be Black. I navigate the ship. I get to inform the culture that I have power and I feel empowered, which is beautiful. It's wonderful. We can see that in these images that they just simply drew pictures of themselves, pictures with their family, engaging in sort of everyday happenings, saying happy, smart, kind, intelligent, that these things that represent what it means to be Black. Um, and related to that, again, with these positive depictions, you can also see where and how they were making this bridge to think about culture and legacy and community as it relates to societal positioning, but also history. So again, these become invitations to delve deeper into what children understand and what they're thinking about. So now we start to see across their images multiple instances where there are symbols of Black culture and pride, things like flags, dancing, drumming, these valued cultural practices that speak to how children are understanding their Black identity as something that is both about them, but it's also about something that came before them. It's about something bigger than just sort of your individual way of moving about in the world. And that I think can be really powerful, but also, again, create lots of openings and invitations to engage more deeply with children about what they're thinking about and what they understand. So again, when we think about these images of Black culture and pride, then we also have things like this. So we look at the top of this image that's at the top here. There are actually two different representations of the same image that you see at the top of the picture, that there's a what looks like a fist. This is a Black Power fist that they drew. And then we have, again, smiling faces, a reference to African dancing. So again, following in this line of thinking about culture and heritage and legacies of empowerment, and thinking about social change and social movements, of course. But then there's something curious happening at the bottom of the drawing. And because in the original drawing you couldn't see it as well, so I edited the drawing so that you could see more clearly what was happening on the bottom of the image. And I think you can see it hopefully you can see it pretty clearly, that there's this source of conflict that's happening here. And so I'm sharing this to also sort of lend itself to a dialogue around how children were also very savvy and attuned to these sources of tension and conflict and the contradictions, the failings in society. And to some extent, in thinking about how something like anti-Blackness can actually become a source of strife, can become a purgatory to some extent, for some within the context of society, because we have this little smaller person, likely melanated person, and something is happening and disrupting the image from being just a happy person and thinking about your culture and heritage to somehow being taunted or being threatened by this person who's laughing at you, who's pointing at you, who's looking at you, who's isolating and who's isolating you. And we can sort of see that taken up again across these images that again are just, I mean, so interesting and so brilliant in terms of their development and their construction, that we have almost the same identical with the image that's in the center, the same identical sort of dynamic that somehow this person, this melanated person is saying, I'm really excited. I have rights. I have my rights. But that somehow this appears to be less melanated person is saying, well, yeah, right. and kind of calling these things into question. And I thought it's really this that these are almost the same. These children are not together when they're doing these drawings, but we see these patterns and themes, these recurring sort of tropes that children kind of understand, are understanding about the world around them. And then if we take a look at the last image, so now we have this person, this Black person that's in existing in this bubble. And this particular child in debriefing the drawing is saying that, what does it mean to be Black? Is kind of partly navigating this bubble where you are surrounded by, in the image, you see these figureheads that have these letters to represent sort of what they represent out in the world. And so, again, very sophisticated representation where, like, the R in this case represented racism, or one of the S's represented sexism, the P represented prejudice, and the B represents bigotry. And so, this idea of kind of being contained. And that is part of the experience, unfortunately, of being Black in society. So again, I share these images that are because I think there's power here in the strategies that Black children were already beginning to employ to reconcile this idea around beauty and affirmation and gifts and resources and terror and unfortunate aspects of our society, ways that we should grow and develop and evolve. That they were thinking about this duality between the more joyful aspects, thinking about their own confidence and their own self-determination, with how that comes into contact around threats and burdens that come with racism. And these things were fully expressed across their interviews and connected to lots of other sources of resources and pervasive issues that they noticed in the world around them. And that children were able to consider and understand and think through solutions to things like police and community violence, thinking about measures for how we might improve schools, and that the images here just really speak to a small slice of that in terms of what they were thinking about and these conversations that we were able to have that were really based on and premised on these ideas of about what children already noticed about the world. And so I can pause there again if there's anything
Uh,
surfacing in the chat.
uh, Folks are wondering if you can remind us about the age of these children. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering if there's time, because there's so much more I know you'd like to share with us. I'm wondering if you could, in addition to telling us about their ages, share with us a little bit what their maybe nonverbal demeanor was like as they were drawing or debriefing with you about
Yeah.
their images.
Sure. Yeah. So a reminder is that, and I should have actually put the age of each child with each image, but that these are fourth and fifth graders. So still in elementary school, but upper elementary school. And in terms of thinking about the demeanor, honestly, I would say generally speaking that they had a pleasant demeanor. The children were very chill, honestly, and talking and thinking through some of these things. But if there were sources of discomfort for children, I noticed that more so in the performance aspect. So you have this blank piece of paper and I'm asking you to draw something. So I would get more concerns about, well, I'm not very good at drawing. Or or I don't know. I don't know. And then usually I would say things like, okay, well, and you have to find ways to affirm that it's not about you demonstrating this, whatever we see of as this high caliber of artistry, but it's more about a mechanism for you just expressing and thinking through your ideas. So I had to do some work around that where it doesn't really matter if you think it's the most perfect drawing or composition. It's more about the ideas and the process, and just try and see what you come up with. And so if there were any sources, I think, of discomfort or children seeming a little unsettled, it was more from like, I'm being asked to do a task and you're kind of watching me do a task, as opposed to once they decided the concept that they wanted to use for the drawings, they were, very candid and expressive in terms of not reticent at all in terms of wanting to share and explain their drawings and just share more of their ideas.
Thank you. I'm also wondering, and you're probably going to get to this as you go on, if you if the children were able to talk with you about the connection between the joy and the affirmation and the challenges in the world that they perceive.
Yeah, I think in some ways, the way that the interview protocols were structured sort of invited them to have more of a free flow, I think, and going moving back and forth. So anytime I ask about issues or challenges or problems, I always begin with asking about resources, desires, sources of joy, and so that we always led with those things. So, for example, like before I asked you about what do you think are some of the biggest problems in your community, we already had an extensive discussion about their loves, the things that they appreciate about their community, the things that help them, the things that they thought were really beautiful. And so that always happened. And then when we talked about problems, we always also talk about solutions. So, well, what do you think about that? And to give these opportunities to be able to dream a little bit, but also from my perspective, to reinforce the idea that problems are solvable, even big problems, that there are small things and big things that we can do to move toward a new, a better, a different, a more just world. And so I tried to also reinforce that without just asking you to say the things that you think are not great, but also let's think and dream together about what might be possible. So I think that's how I tried to strategically create these opportunities to make the connections. But I will also say that I felt that when children were expressing, say, the good and the bad around aspects of, like, say, the experience of being Black, that they naturally, in my opinion, move back and forth between, well, on one hand, there's this, and on the other hand, it's that. That it didn't seem to be this overwhelming because I can recognize that there are still ways that racism may manifest in our society, but that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I love my family, I love my community, and I feel like, there's a lot of wonderful things for me to accomplish in the world, or that doesn't take anything away from my history or my ancestors or things like that, that they seemed, for the most part, that they were already able to, they weren't to move back and forth between those things and say that it can be a both and, in terms of their experiences.
And you talked about at the beginning, you had to sort of work with their performance concerns about,
Yeah.
"Oh, I'm not good at drawing or it's not going to be pretty." And so I imagine you wouldn't later on say, "Oh, you're a really good artist. You did a beautiful job," because that's not really what the point was.
Yeah.
But where did the conversations end up? And did you have a sense of what they were left with, or what they held as you wrapped up and they went on to the rest of their lives?
Yeah, yeah, and I talk about this, I think, in the plan of how I was gonna sort of wrap up, but I
Oh,
was
okay. We
really
can we
struck.
can wait. We can wait if
Yeah,
you.
no, you're not taking my thunder, but I will just say, I will say quickly that I was very moved by, I had no idea that the experience would be such a meaningful experience for children. Like, and I guess this is your adult gaze, and like I wanted them to have a good experience. I didn't want them to be traumatized by talking to me about these things, but I didn't realize how much the experience would seem like it meant for them in the moment to have this opportunity to kind of elaborate on things that they were thinking about. I didn't expect that children after the fact would like, oh, I wish there was another interview, or their friends and they want to be interviewed now and stuff. And so yeah, so that I think that again was great affirmation and feedback for me. That maybe speaks to some larger points or ideas or things that we could talk about in the field of, like, how often do children get opportunities like this? And then there was also the thing of, like, we get to the end of the interview and I probably had at least a handful of kids who would say, "Woo, you ask a lot of questions." Why do you ask so many questions? Like, I had one or two at least that said, "Why do you ask so many questions?" And then you do your best to explain more about the rationale of, like, what you want to know. But I even appreciated that they felt a sense of permission and even being able to say that to me as someone
Exactly.
who they
Yeah,
had
that's
gotten
what I was
to
gonna say.
know, but
Yeah.
you don't see, you haven't known me for years. You don't see me every day, so sure. Should I go ahead and move forward?
Yeah, please. Yeah,
Okay.
you have so much wonderful work. I know we won't get to all of it today.
Yeah.
I hope we can keep on learning about your work. But yes, let's move forward.
Okay, great. So what I was thinking I would do is just to kind of kick off this last segment with I couldn't help myself, but a little bit of help from Toni Morrison. So a dear friend of mine and a scholar, prolific scholar, his name is Manuel Espinosa. But he reintroduced me to this segment of the novel Beloved by Toni Morrison. And this description, for those of you that may have read the text or heard of the text of this space called the clearing. And actually, the mixed media image that you see here was created by one of my former students, who's now an award-winning classroom teacher. His name is Tracy Jackson. And in the image, he wasn't trying to illustrate Toni Morrison's concept of the clearing, but in my mind, I saw this picture and I said, this is what I imagine it would look like. So in that text, the narrator describes this space that's called the clearing as a wide open space cut deep in the woods, but nobody knew for what or why. And in the text, they say that the people waited in the trees to be called into the clearing. And then I'm just going to read a small snippet verbatim from that text. That then she shouted, "Let the children come." And they ran from the trees toward her. "Let your mothers hear you laugh," she told them. And the woods rang. The adults looked on and could not help smiling. Then let the grown men come, she shouted. They stepped out one by one from among the ringing trees. "Let your wives and your children hear you, see you dance," she told them, and ground life shuddered under their feet. Finally, she called the women to her. "Cry," she told them, "for the living and the dead just cry." And without covering their eyes, the women let loose. It started that way, laughing children, dancing men, crying women, and then it got mixed up. Women stopped crying and danced. Men sat down and cried. Children danced. Women laughed. Children cried until exhausted and riven, all and each lay about in the clearing. And so I believe, as a researcher engaging with Black children, that there's depth and power in what children know, and that my work is fundamentally about clearings, right? That this is where the theories that we have in the actual work, the artful method, like where it meets, where children get to dance, they can cry, they can laugh, they can create, they get to learn in kinship with adults. And I've said, I think a few times so far that I talk a lot about invitations and openings in this space to express for children to express their ideas, but also to have their ideas taken seriously. And that there are some pillars that describe that process that maybe are adaptable to a range of contexts and probably would not be surprising based on some of the things that I've talked about today. And so I'll just say a couple of things about these three pillars, and then I have a couple of examples. So the first is kind of thinking about the modality, thinking about the aesthetic of an experience, thinking about where artfulness comes in. Is there actually room for coloring outside of the lines within the context of a discourse or an activity? And I explained that, of course, there were images. I've integrated images into my work, but I think the key there is lifting up the images so that alongside the things that children say, that these things are equally valuable, that it's not just that I'm having you draw something so that it's fun and that it's kind of a superficial accessory to the experience, but that I think that there's something really important for us to know and understand, even in your artful creations. And also recognizing that as adults, what we might be most interested in knowing is probably likely to be far different than what children might be interested in sharing with us in the moment. And so, where is there patience? Where can we refigure time together and align and sort of think about what it means to move with the ebbs and flows of children? And related to that, the refiguring of time, the patience is like the curation of an experience. So, how are we guiding children through a pedagogical experience that involves some space to dwell, to sit with things, to look beyond that? We're looking for something beyond what might be the most efficient response. And I think that this example here of a fifth grader is really, really powerful to kind of depict that. So essentially, we have Diamond was explaining something to me about the school context and kind of what's happening here, how kids are experiencing school. And basically, she says, like, people, they don't realize what they're doing or who they are. And then she says, I don't know. It's kind of complicated. And where we could imagine lots of interviews or experiences where we say, okay, it's complicated and we just move on. But what I said is, I said, okay, I think I understand what you're saying. I'm just trying to, when you said that they don't really understand reality, I'm trying to think, I'm trying to think of who you're talking about. So instead of just moving on, like where are there spaces and invitation to maybe think, like we don't have to rush to the next topic just because it's kind of complicated. And then look what Diamond says to me. Then she gives me this whole story of where there's kids with all of this detail. So there's kids get into fights. She starts talking about the morning meetings that happened in school a couple of weeks ago. So we get in a fight. It's really big. It could be really big or really small, but this one was really big. You get suspended. And some kid will say, wow, you're suspended. I get to go home early. And they're not thinking of the consequences. So we're starting to make real like consequences. Sometimes parents have to go to work and the kids are home on their phones and stuff like that. And the parents are just saying, oh my God, I gotta go to work. And so I just am, even reading it again, I'm so moved by what opened up by just saying, we don't have to rush to the next topic. I'm just trying to understand, who are you talking about? From this thing that could have closed off a conversation. I don't know. It's kind of complicated. So finally, um, that relates to this piece is like the wondering more and fixing less. I think adults, we become really good at sort of orienting ourselves toward fixing things for kids. And so I think an important piece too is withholding opinions or suggestions at times, outside of, safety concerns, but that everything doesn't have to be fixed in the moment, that we can allow space for children to redirect, to revise their own ideas. And these are a couple of good examples of thinking about a redirection and also a revision on ideas when we just let things play out and see, what happens in terms of the discourse. So in this first example, this was an example where I was asking children about to identify what they thought were big problems in their community and society. And so I had noted what children said were the big problems. And then we were talking about solutions to those problems. And I noticed with this particular child, this child said, I think the biggest problem is that they need to fix the roads and stuff. But then I said, well, they need to fix the roads. You didn't name that one before when I asked you about problems and big problems. And so this is me even struggling to not say, well, I'm like, you named all of these big, huge problems, and now we're talking about the roads. Like, where did that come from? And then the child says, well, it is important though, because there's holes in the streets. And so I said, okay, the streets, yes. So again, how do you think that problem can be solved? So again, even in that moment, I'm thinking through, I'm like, resist the urge to redirect, redirect. And then the child says, if the governor gets the people to fix the streets and stuff, then maybe it'll make it better. So actually in the redirection, we kind of come back to these connections to some of these other ideas because I see how this issue of potholes in the street for this child actually have a more significant meaning than just the aesthetics or the fact that our cars bump as we're moving along in the road. And then finally, this example from Andrew, who I did manage to say that he was 10 at the time, where he says to me, there's no more like racist, but sometimes there is. There's no more slavery, yeah, and there's no more of them signs and stuff. And I said, yeah. But then you said, but sometimes there still is. So when he was referring to signs and stuff, he's thinking about like Jim Crow era, Jim Crow South, and sort of these things that we know were helping to communicate the laws at that time around segregation. And then he says, oh, yeah, but there's no more slavery. Again, doubling down on the previous point, re-emphasizing, but sometimes people in other states could still hate white, I mean, Black people. So again, where is this invitation to say, okay, well, what do we mean by that? Or can you tell me more about why you understand why or how you understand that to be true. So rather than jumping into a lecture about how we're not living in a post-racial society and yes, racism still exists, by just listening and seeing what happens in terms of the revision of ideas. And it actually leads you to a place where there are clearer points of access to understand how children drew particular conclusions. And then we might be able to think about what it means for us to love to learn together. So, just to close, I wanted to say that I think the subjective and intellectual experience of learning together with children can change us. That while certainly I think there are things that children may say that can concern us and offer us a window into some of the worst parts of our society, it can also direct us to their brilliance and remind us of what is possible. And I see some of those possibilities in lots of things that they said to me, but I just pulled out a few examples. So that we have a fifth grader who can say to me that it's kind of hard just sitting down and watching things not get better. People need to get up and get on their feet, not just sit down and watch TV and say, I'm sleepy. Like, help save the world, get each other together and talk. And that an 11-year-old would say to me these openings to say that I can start small, but then give my opinions out there and I can challenge things like financial systems and justice systems, any kinds of systems that I and the majority of other people think are unfair. Black people, we have to stay quiet and get ahead. That's the message. But I think we need to speak out, get loud, and stand up. And that a fourth grader could say to me that I'm thinking everybody in the world should help solve social issues because that's happening to everybody. Problems are not just happening to this specific person, it is happening to everybody. So if everybody teams up against that one person or one group, we are sure that we, the people, are going to win the case. And I think that even if we don't find ourselves wrestling with ideas this big, these lofty goals, financial system, the justice system, that there's also beauty, and I mentioned before, around what we can interactionally establish in the moment with children. And so I thought I'd close related to a comment before with this, a comment from Juliana about what the experience of the interview meant for her. And so Juliana said to me that the interviews were great, but I'm kind of sad that it's over. And I said, well, you can talk to me about stuff. I see you anytime. And then she says, yeah, you make me feel welcome wherever I am. Every time I think of you, it's just one spot in my heart that just fits you inside. And so with that, on that note, I will say thank you all for listening, and I'll take, of course, any questions if there are any.
Wow. There was one question about why do you think it's important for children to understand so much so young? I think your point is not that you're making a judgment about it's being important, but just if we listen and allow ourselves to be changed, we'll discover that whether we know it or not, they already are understanding a lot more than we often imagine.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, and this is a space where there are lots of things that might come up in the context of an interview that I certainly wish children didn't know or hadn't experienced, or that we could live in a world where this maybe wouldn't be a part of their reality. But then there are also things that give me deep insight into what children are already practicing in terms of their critical sense making, what they are learning, their ability to be able to synthesize ideas, their ability to be able to strive and move forward. That again helps to speak to sort of the ways that they're growing and developing that can be really powerful and maybe are necessary to kind of help lead us towards some of the meaningful changes in society. And so again, trying to get a sense of where they are and what they already understand, because I think one thing that's evident here is that children are noticing and thinking about a lot of things. It's just adults are not directly engaging them in that thinking. And then by the time we start thinking and talking to them when they're adolescents or in adults, but at that point we've already really cemented lots of ideas in terms of like how they see the world, and also taught them that these ideas have been kind of marinating and developing with very little direct interaction or respect from adults. And then we sort of can continue in that cycle. And so I think part of this work is like, what does it mean to intervene in that so that we can start having earlier, more robust conversations about really the experience of being human for, in my case, for Black children, but also for children everywhere.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis. I am so grateful for the wisdom you've shared with us today and for the work that you are doing. I, your point or the point that a child made about how deep listening really requires us to be ready to be changed ourselves
Mhm.
um, is so powerful. So we hope you'll all come back again in uh, January of 2026 when Learning to Listen launches its 2026 year. Thanks again, Professor Davis, for joining us today, and thank you all for the work that you all do.
Yeah. Thank you.